1,000 years before the idea was even thought of in the West, the Chinese were using drilling rigs like these to exploit their vast resources of salt, natural gas and oil, 2,000 feet below the Earth's surface. In this reenactment, a rhythmic dance is used to lift, then drop a heavy iron bit, which gradually works its way through the rock and earth below. The salt industry here in Sichuan province, central China, was established some 250 years before Christ by a remarkable government official, Li Bing. Shortly afterwards, when China's warring states were unified and the empire established, men like Li Bing were taken into the imperial bureaucracy, which was crucial in shaping China's destiny. For almost 2,000 years, it was imperial bureaucrats who governed the empire, developed its great industries, and defined its cultural values. Values very different from those of the West. By the 13th century, when Marco Polo sailed past this bridge into the city of Suzhou, China had become the richest, most powerful, and most stable empire the world had ever known. But all this was achieved at a price. This is modern China, committed to catching up with the West. But why did the Chinese slip behind in their industrial and economic development? To answer this is to dispel the common myth that technology alone holds the key to modernization. What's far more significant is the relationship between technology and the social and economic values of a society. It's ironic that in the 16th century, when Europeans were establishing their great mercantile empires around the world, these inventions were regarded as the foundation of their growing wealth and power. Books printed on paper, which dramatically expanded access to scientific and technological knowledge. The compass, which allowed merchant fleets to navigate the globe. Gunpowder and cannon, which provided the military power to impose their will upon others. At the time, few Europeans had any idea that these had not only been invented in China, but were in common use for at least 500 years. Which raises some interesting questions. Why weren't Chinese junks turning up in European ports, bristling with guns and demanding trade? And why is this a European cannon pointing towards China and not a Chinese cannon pointing at Europe? These are some of the issues I want to explore with you. How, in the long history of people's efforts to build the good society, their Xanadu, have the centers of economic power, creativity, and innovation shifted from China to Europe to America, and now perhaps again to Asia. For many of us, China appears to be taking on the character of a modern, rather westernized society. Yet many Chinese continue to uphold the traditional values on which China's early success was built. Showing reverence and respect for scholars and officials remains central to these values. For this modern family, a visit to a temple dedicated to Li Bing is a chance to demonstrate their respect. For them, Li Bing is a model of the selfless official who worked to improve the lot of others. But teaching respect is no easy matter, even in China. In many ways, these values are not surprising. It was government officials who first established many of China's great industries, promoting new technologies and new methods of production. The salt wells here in Sichuan are a good example. What's so impressive about these early technologies is their simple and ingenious use of local materials. This plaited bamboo rope, used to lift the drill bit, has a tensile strength equal to that of modern steel wire. Here, the salt brine is brought to the surface in a tube, also made of bamboo. Methane gas, often found near the brine, was skillfully used in the production of the salt. The gas was extremely dangerous when mixed with air, and so barrels, which worked rather like the carburetor in a motor car, were placed over the wellhead. The gas was then carried in bamboo pipes to giant cast iron vats, where it was lit and used to boil off the brine. The brilliant efficiency of this system meant that the vats could operate 24 hours a day to produce salt of the highest quality. Salt in the ancient world was essential to survival. It was used to preserve food. In 13th century China, this was a highly profitable business. Salt produced here in Zhigung was sold throughout China on behalf of the Son of Heaven, the Emperor Kublai Khan, whose power and influence extended from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. Salt was one of the great imperial monopolies, which from time to time included iron, tea, silk, porcelain, and even ginseng. To manage these vast enterprises, some of the largest in the world, the emperors of China employed an army of bureaucrats drawn from all parts of the globe. China's great cities and the staggering size of its population and industries astounded these early travelers and continues to fascinate visitors from the West. Lured by the silk, porcelain, and other exquisite trade goods, China's great wealth drew Arab, Persian, and even European merchants like Marco Polo. In the accounts of their journeys, they portrayed a country of magnificent pagodas and palaces, like the emperor's summer retreat of Xanadu. In the West, Xanadu became known as Xanadu, an ideal place of beauty, wealth, and harmony. The Emperor Kublai Khan was himself a foreigner, a Mongol invader who had been absorbed into Chinese culture, not just because of its refinement and wealth, but because it offered a supremely rational and efficient system of imperial government. This system, which provided the crucial framework for China's early development, was based on the teachings of Confucius, a remarkable scholar and reformer of the 5th century BC.
Confucianism was a very simple set of ideas Confucius and his disciples worked out, but they were based on something already there, the Chinese family, which they then articulated principles to explain and to consolidate. And at the heart of it all, the family relationship is the base. It is the model upon which all other human relations should follow. And then it became quite sophisticated about how the members of family, clans, and so on should behave towards one another, and extended that to the rest of society. That if the whole society consisted of a number of well-organized clans and families, all well integrated and harmoniously developing within itself, then those values would also become prevalent in all of society. And the kind of values of filial piety can easily be translated into loyalty towards the emperor. And that's where the two ends, as it were, meet beautifully, ending with loyalty to the emperor, so the emperor couldn't have asked for more.
The strength of the Confucian system was the way it provided not only for the emperor, but for the ordinary people as well. In the 13th century, as today, most of China's population worked the land. Surplus produce was paid to the emperor as tax, and in return, he was responsible for ensuring social harmony and maintaining public works. With an empire the size of all Europe, this was no small task, especially when at least one province each year was threatened by a drought, famine, or flood. China's great rivers were seen as arteries in a living landscape. Their management was crucial to the harmony and well-being of the state. From the foothills of the Himalayas and the Kunlun Mountains in the west, these rivers bring with them the rich silt that for centuries had allowed Chinese farmers to support themselves and their families on a fraction of the land traditionally required in Europe for the same purpose. But this silt comes at a price. If you farm floodplains, then you must control rivers. This Chinese feature film recalls the flooding of the Minjiang River, which regularly devastated the villages of the Chengdu Plains in Sichuan. The hero is a government official, none other than Li Bing, who's portrayed here attempting to control a panicking crowd. He is still celebrated for his achievement in taming this river. To prevent the flooding, Li Bing had an ingenious system of canals designed which would also irrigate the plains. Today, with some modern additions, the system is still in use. This is the island Li Bing had built up to divide the river. The outer channel carries the fast-flowing water directly downstream to the Yangtze. The nearer one carries the slower stream into the irrigation canals. When the river rises, it spills back over this weir into the outer channel, preventing any flooding in the irrigation canals. The massive workforce required to build and maintain these public works was made up of farmers and laborers and supervised by officials like Li Bing. These people were expected to give their labor during the less demanding period of the agricultural year, and in return, they were provided with food and shelter by the state. In this way, the Confucian bonds of obligation between the individual and the state, so essential to the empire, could be reaffirmed and strengthened. The empire's dependence on agriculture for its wealth led China to develop the world's most productive system of farming. Wet rice cultivation could produce 4 times more protein per acre than farming in Europe. But it required access to water and the technology to control it. This method of farming was to be transformed by an agricultural revolution in the 11th century, organized by imperial officials. But it's one of those great paradoxes that this revolution also created one of China's greatest contemporary problems, its population. Not surprisingly, this is called a dragon's backbone pump. It's an ingenious device invented for lifting water from one level to another, and is still commonly used. Imperial scholars, seeing its potential in opening up new rice fields, published books about it and promoted its use to farmers. This was the sort of technology which could be disseminated rapidly. The wily bureaucrats even offered tax incentives to encourage its use, along with other new methods of farming. As a result, more and more paddy fields were opened up, demanding increased cooperation between farmers and officials in organizing the water. Then imperial officials discovered a new type of rice, which matured much faster than any of the local varieties. Champa rice was introduced from the southern provinces, now called Vietnam, around the year 1012. As a result, 2 crops could be produced each year instead of the normal one. This allowed a dramatic increase in the number of people who could live and work on the same area of land. It was this Sung Dynasty Green Revolution which sowed the seeds for China's ever-expanding population. To keep the delicate balance of this system, the state was forced to make agriculture its most important priority. This allowed little room for change. China was trapped by its own success, a success which has led to today's population of over 1 billion people, 80% of whom still work on the land. The responsibility for the agricultural system lay ultimately in the hands of the emperor. And so, to ensure the cooperation of nature and the fertility of the land, he would open the agricultural year by ritually ploughing the first furrow. In China, the emperor was believed to be the son of heaven, and as such was responsible for maintaining the harmony between mankind and the forces governing the universe. Each year, on behalf of the emperor, calendars were produced to coordinate ritual and agricultural events, like planting or the opening and closing of irrigation canals. The animals depict different months. The rat, the monkey, and the snake are marked as being lucky. The calendars were also expected to predict auspicious heavenly events, such as eclipses and the passing of comets. Astronomy was therefore essential to running the empire. This modern observatory, near the ancient capital of Nanjing, continues the tradition of observation once required for the imperial calendars. In the past, the Chinese believed that people, places, and institutions were directly represented in the heavens. Instruments like this celestial sphere help predict any changes. Astronomy was especially important because the emperor's mandate to rule had conditions. If he or any of his bureaucrats failed to carry out their responsibilities, heaven would express its dissatisfaction.
Now let me tell you an interesting story that happened in the year 340 AD about a certain person who could have been one of my own ancestors, although I have no evidence to prove this fact. At that time, Ho Chung was the Secretary of State, and he also held the post Attorney General. And it was reported by the Astronomer Royal that the planet Mars was sighted near the star Zavijawa, which represented the post of the Attorney General. Now, that was regarded as a disastrous event, a disastrous omen for the Attorney General himself. Whereupon, Ho Chung, hoping to avert the calamity, asked the emperor to transfer him to another post. The logic behind it, of course, was that since he no longer held the position of Attorney General, he was absorbed from all the responsibilities of the disasters predicted by the astronomer.
Each evening, officials of the Bureau of Astronomy recorded the events of the night sky. Their findings were treated like state secrets because any leak could be used against the emperor. And during unpopular dynasties, the sightings of unfavorable portents went up dramatically. The Bureau of Astronomy was therefore extremely influential. And it was their need for accurate predictions which led to the discovery of a more precise means of measuring time.
Well, the clock is, after all, one of the greatest measuring devices that mankind has ever invented. And what people generally don't realize is that the first invention of it was in China, the mechanical clock. This one, particular one, is modeled on the Susung clock of 1084. A stream of water from a constant level tank poured into a bucket on the rim of the wheel like that. First of all, it tipped the counterweighted lever, and then it tipped another one which allowed the next bucket to come through in the series.
The original Susung clock stood a massive 30 feet high and was set up in the imperial palace at Kaifang. But despite the ingenuity of this invention, perhaps the most interesting thing about the mechanical clock in China is that it never left the palace, and its technological potential was never fully realized. Why this happened illustrates how the values of the imperial bureaucracy determined which technologies were important for the empire. This is a Chinese model of Susung's clock on public display at the History Museum in Beijing. In contrast, the original was made exclusively for the emperor and was treated as something of a secret, like other technologies associated with astronomy. Its careful gearing, driven by the great water wheel, operated a whole range of devices. Rotating figures told the time of day, bells were rung every 2 European hours, and drums were beaten at midnight and noon. On the top floor, a celestial globe told scholars which stars were rising and setting. The imperial household also found an intriguing use for the clock in preparing the horoscope of some future son of heaven. His astrological destiny was determined at the time of conception, not birth. Now, the moment of imperial ecstasy could be documented precisely, without even a glance at the heavens. But for the imperial officials who ran China's vast agricultural empire, the clock was of little importance. It was even less important to the majority of Chinese, whose lives continued to be governed by the imperial calendar and the cycles of the seasons. So, in 1127, when northern invaders drove the Sung dynasty out of Kaifeng, this clock was allowed to fall to bits and was never rebuilt. The mechanical clock, so fundamental to the development of the West, did not appear again in China until it arrived with European missionaries in the 16th century. While the mechanical clock never really took off in China, paper and printing, the basic tools of bureaucracy, certainly did. The centralized control and dissemination of information was seen as essential for good government. Encyclopedias on a wide variety of subjects were published in imperial workshops and distributed to officials throughout the provinces. The officials who ran the empire were selected for their positions in the bureaucratic hierarchy on the basis of their scholastic achievements. This was done through the world's oldest written examination, based on the rote learning of the Confucian classics. These taught the 5 virtues of benevolence, righteousness, propriety, wisdom, and trustworthiness. For 1400 years, these exams were accepted as the only legitimate path to power and status within the empire. There were 3 levels of exams: the county, provincial, and at the imperial capital, which was supervised by the emperor himself. Bells would be rung around 4 a.m. and the ordeal would begin. Anything up to 30,000 scholars would attend the county exams, and it would have taken at least 6 years of arduous study to get just this far. On your performance in this examination depended your future career, social status, and even the prosperity of your family. For this reason, enormous efforts were made to make these exams as fair as possible. On entering your cell, you were identified and given a number. Even your written work was copied out before marking to prevent favored students being identified by their calligraphy. With so much at stake, it's little wonder that some students should revert to cheating. Silk crib sheets, like these, containing key passages from the Confucian classics as well as model essays, were hidden in the lining of clothing, in food, and anywhere else the wit of man could devise. Despite this, the system did select out men of intelligence to run the empire. But it also made them extraordinarily conservative by standardizing their values. While only a small number of graduates made it to the higher levels of the civil service, there were other professions considered appropriate for Confucian scholars. Medicine was one of these. This is the Yawang Mountain Medical Temple in Shanxi Province. It's dedicated to Su Si Mao, a physician of the Tang dynasty. Here, ancient figures celebrate medical heroes, physicians who developed new drugs and methods of treatment. Insignias on their robes indicate their status as scholars or graduates from the Imperial Medical Academy. They invented forensic medicine and the world's first method of smallpox inoculation. Their findings and methods were recorded in imperial encyclopedias. In 1057, the Emperor Zhensong commissioned an encyclopedia of all known medicinal plants within China. He drew on the vast network of scholar officials, and after 25 years of research, an extensive pharmaceutical natural history was available for distribution. Carved on these stone tablets are hundreds of prescriptions and treatments contained in the medical encyclopedias. And people would come here to copy them. This method of making useful knowledge available was commonplace throughout China. In Xi'an, they even transcribed onto stone the Confucian classics, which could be duplicated by anyone attempting to pass through the tough imperial examination. These were the photocopiers of ancient China. While the imperial bureaucrats were concerned with maintaining harmony in public life, they were also expected to cultivate inner harmony in their private lives. In this, they were profoundly influenced by Taoism. Unlike the Confucians, these Taoist monks believed that the ideal of social harmony was only possible when each individual had achieved inner harmony. These men were deeply preoccupied with an inner spiritual transformation, one which they believed would allow them to live in harmony with the Tao, the way of nature. All things for them were an expression of qi, a universal energy which took either yin or yang forms, female and male, passive and active. They also believed that through an inner alchemy, they could achieve a form of immortality. By concentrating their breathing and chanting, they sought to purify the raw sexual energy lodged at the base of the spine. This, they believed, could be gradually refined by an inner fire, transforming the body and mind into an immortal form, which, like gold, would neither perish nor decay. This inner alchemy was paralleled by a more material discipline, an alchemy concerned with the transformation of metals and chemicals. By heating and reheating mixtures of mercury and sulfur, for example, it was possible to produce cinnabar, a reddish compound which some alchemists promoted as an elixir of immortality.
Nowadays, it's been widely accepted that modern chemistry has its origins in ancient Chinese alchemy. These immortality pills were found in the tomb of a woman who died 1700 years ago during the Jin dynasty. After mixing sulfur, mercury, and other ingredients in this crucible, they were heated and reheated to produce an entirely new compound. As the pills were mainly mercuric sulfide, they were quite poisonous, but they had some therapeutic use because the mercury content would kill bacteria.
Unfortunately, these immortality pills killed numerous emperors and court officials, often depicted contemplating the joys of joining the immortals high in the clouds. Despite these somewhat costly experiments, Chinese physicians learned to make new and safer drugs, combining the alchemist compounds with traditional herbs and plants. When taken to the West by Arab physicians, these ideas played a major role in the development of European medicine. The Arabs called this Chinese snow. It's saltpeter, one of the key ingredients used in alchemic experiments. When mixed with charcoal and sulfur, it produced one of the most potent compounds discovered by the Chinese. It was used as a treatment for skin disease and as a fumigant to kill insects. It was also used to produce intense heat. But when taken up by the Imperial Chinese armies, it was to transform the world's military technology. This is gunpowder. Imperial encyclopedias graphically recorded the effects of these new gunpowder weapons. But their use in battle was never really significant until the Sung Empire was invaded by the Qin Tatar along their northern borders. From that time on, explosives were to change the face of warfare. There clearly were some ingenious and rather nasty bombs being thrown around China in the 11th century. Most of them much larger than this one, but even this could have quite an impact. Some were packed with chemicals such as arsenic and sulfur and produced poisonous gas. Others were filled with tar and oil and acted like napalm. The largest, a fragmentation bomb, could flatten an area the size of a modest house. By the end of the 12th century, these bombs, along with rockets and cannon, were of sufficient military significance to the beleaguered Sung Emperor that he started a bureau of munitions with 11 factories and 40,000 workers. In 1221, in one day, they produced 17,000 of these exploding rockets and 21,000 of these bombs. Even with the vast number and range of these weapons, there was considerable secrecy surrounding their production, and their use was contained by the imperial bureaucracy. They had a quite legitimate fear that if they got into the hands of the barbarians beyond the frontiers, the results could be disastrous. And they were right. In the hands of the barbarians of medieval Europe, the crossbow and the cannon, military technology from China, had very different consequences. The castle, that bastion of feudal power, was no longer impenetrable. These weapons were rapidly improved by warring feudal lords attempting to extend their power and influence. This created Europe's nation-states. The struggle between them for the control of trade shifted power to merchants and a new military class. Europe, unlike China, was never to be unified. By the late 14th century, Italian city-states like Venice were hiring mercenary armies to protect the interests of their merchants. These merchants, now free from feudal constraints, had gained extraordinary wealth from their domination of trade with the East. They had also won political control of the state itself. As a result, they were to build the new social and economic institutions of capitalism.
In Europe, there was no strong central state. You could have the Venetians running their own state, merchants dominating their own states. Genoans did the same. The Chinese could never do that. Their state was a centralized bureaucratic state. And therefore, if the merchants went too far or went beyond what the state wanted, the state would stop them. The Chinese empire depended basically on agrarian revenues. The tax was enough to keep the emperor pretty well off, as you all know from the imperial tombs and so on. They never really needed the merchants to that extent.
Yet long before the rise of the European nation-states, China very nearly took the path of capitalism. In 1127, the Sung emperor was driven south of this river, the Yangtze, by the invading Qin Tatar. This split the empire in half. To protect his new frontier, the emperor built a massive navy. In the course of this, the world's first paddle boat was invented to move troops around the shallow waterways. All this cost a great deal. With agricultural tax revenues from the northern provinces cut off and facing the high cost of war, the emperor was forced to print more money and to promote trade. As taxes from trade grew, he became increasingly dependent on his merchants. Their power and influence was to grow, as in the city-states of Europe.
That's what we call the rise of the bourgeoisie. You know that in China there was the famous phrase, the four ranks of society, Shen Nung Gung Shang. The classes of society were the scholar bureaucrats at the top, and then the farmers, and then below them the artisans, the Gungren, and finally the merchants. They were in the last place of all. And although some of them became very wealthy, nevertheless no son of a rich merchant wanted to be a rich merchant. In turn, he wanted to get in and take the imperial examinations and get into the civil service and become a gentleman, in fact.
But now, merchants who could produce large foreign earnings were offered honorary degrees without even having to sit for the imperial exams. After centuries of disdain for trade, imperial officials found themselves being sent overseas on trade missions on behalf of the emperor. Confucian priorities were thrown to the wind. But while Chinese merchants were setting up shop overseas, foreign traders were now increasingly drawn to China. Here in the ancient port city of Canton, descendants of Arab traders who came in the wake of China's expanding international trade still come to pray. During the Sung and Mongol dynasties, large communities of Muslims were established in Canton and at Quanzhou on the Fujian coast. These communities acted as agents, purchasing and shipping silk, tea and porcelain, produced specifically for export. By the high seas and the Silk Roads, the luxuries of China flowed west, and Venetians like Marco Polo grew rich. New medicines and spices, paper making and printing techniques, the compass and gunpowder all came to Europe this way. But the Venetian monopoly of this trade was soon to be challenged by this man, known as Henry the Navigator, brother of the King of Portugal. Henry was determined to find a direct route to Asia by sea in order to get around the Venetian and Genoese control of the trade. His ships combined the best of Arab and Chinese technologies. They were fitted with lateen sails, sternpost rudders, and the compass. These were the forerunners of the great European fleets, which would bring to the West the riches of the East. Had the Portuguese ships reached the Indian Ocean just 70 years earlier, they could well have met these mighty craft, 5 times their size, the treasure ships of the 3-jeweled eunuch, Admiral Zhang He. Unlike those of the Portuguese, these were not trading ships. In 1405, the emperor of the new Ming dynasty sent Zhang He on the first of 7 remarkable voyages of discovery and diplomacy to Africa, India, and the Middle East, to impress the world with the power and majesty of the Celestial Empire. These are copies of the charts which Zhang He used on his voyages. Had he been instructed, he could have sailed around the Cape of Good Hope and on to Europe. Such fleets sailing into the Mediterranean could well have changed the course of history. This magnificent Sung lighthouse stands as a reminder of the direction China might have followed, one of maritime expansion taken by the European nation-states. But in the 15th century, the priorities of the Ming dynasty were to change dramatically.
This ancient beacon here on the Fujian coast has guided seamen into the port of Quanzhou for 1,000 years. Past here have come Marco Polo and even Zhang He on one of his many voyages to Africa and the Middle East. It's really one of those extraordinary ironies of history, that at the same time that the Europeans were beginning their great voyages of discovery, with tiny Portuguese caravels cautiously moving down the west coast of Africa en route for Asia, Zheng He's great fleets was traveling along this coastline for the last time. In 1433, the Ming Emperor disbanded his fleets, stopped his merchants from engaging in foreign trade, and China, from that point, ceased to be a maritime power.
However strange this decision might seem from a contemporary perspective, for the conservative bureaucracy who advised the emperor, it made perfect sense. They had reunited the empire and reasserted its traditional Confucian values after centuries of domination by foreign dynasties. In 1415, this Grand Canal was also completed. It linked the rich rice-growing regions of the south with the new Ming capital of Beijing in the north, 1,000 kilometers away. Along these waterways, they could now ship the vast quantities of grain and other provisions needed in Beijing and for the expanded armies on the vulnerable northern frontiers. Previously, this had all gone by sea, where they could be raided by pirates. Now, with resources stretched and no conceivable threat from the sea, the great Ming Navy, 6,500 ships, the biggest in the world, had become an expendable luxury.
The Ming Dynasty came on board and recognized that the agrarian empire had been threatened by the Mongols, who had been there for 100 years before that, and they wanted to re-endorse the agrarian nature of that empire. And then the role of the merchants had to be kept in place once more. No encouragement to merchants, and as a result of which, the merchants were told not to go overseas. Foreign trade was to be discouraged. If the Ming China wanted foreign trade, we'll invite foreign merchants to come and pay tribute to the Emperor of China, and we get foreign goods that way. We don't need to send our merchants out to get these things. We don't want Chinese to go out of the country. No need at all. You stay home and be good farmers, most of you, and that'll be fine.
So completely did the Ming emperors turn from the sea that within 100 years, the art of building the massive treasure ships used by Zheng He had been totally lost. China's withdrawal into its own cultural and economic boundaries was to provide the empire with centuries of peace, stability, and harmony, unattainable in the West. It was achieved, though, at a price. For the price of harmony was to forego the extraordinary potential offered by the social and economic changes taking place on the other side of the globe. Ironically, as China closed its gates on the world, the European nation-states began to build a new and very different road to Xanadu, one which would bring to the Celestial Empire the seeds of its destruction. astronomical instruments on Beijing's ancient city wall, built by Jesuit missionaries some 350 years ago. They were central to their plans to convert the Chinese Empire to Christianity. As they set out from their seminary in Macau, they were the forerunners of European expansion into the East. They had come with Portuguese trading fleets in the late 16th century. Somber figures who sought to win souls for Christ as eagerly as the merchants who brought them sought profits. Francis Xavier, the leader of the Jesuit mission, believed that by converting the all-powerful Emperor of China, he could win the East for Christ. To accomplish this, the Jesuits brought not the sword and the Bible, which had won them South America, but Western science and mathematics, which made these instruments indispensable to the emperor. By demonstrating the superiority of their scientific knowledge, they hoped to convince the emperor of the superiority of their religion.
It's really rather ironic that at the same time, back in Europe, the Pope was busily arresting astronomers such as Galileo for using precisely the same mathematical ideas that are embodied in these instruments to demonstrate that the Earth went around the sun, a fact that unfortunately contradicted church dogma. So why was it that despite the repression, over the next 300 years, it was in Europe and not China that the growth of scientific and technological knowledge was to have such a profound impact?
In answering this, we need to appreciate the extraordinary conservatism of China's celestial empire and to explore the restless European vision of progress that finally led these two great civilizations into a devastating confrontation. In the early 17th century, China had little need of the world beyond its boundaries. Its economy, equal to that of all Europe, was completely self-sufficient. Water power was used to drive its great industries. These trip hammers are still used to crush kaolin rock, essential for making Chinese porcelain, unequaled anywhere in the world. Silk, produced on these complex draw looms, had been a luxury in the West since Roman times. Metallurgy and its application in agriculture and industry had been mastered while Europe was still in the Dark Ages. However, it was wet rice agriculture that gave China its great wealth. It was the world's most productive system of farming and the empire's highest priority. To manage this sophisticated and powerful empire, the Chinese had evolved a unique form of bureaucratic government. Officials gained power through examinations, not birth, as was the case in Europe. These bureaucrats and the emperor himself based their values on the teachings of Confucius.
The Chinese state concentrated on training scholars in Confucianism who, having grasped all the principles of good government and harmonious societies, then were placed in key positions throughout the country, provinces, county, down to the county level. And through them, they could guide the whole population, offer the main principles of government to everyone, and the rest of it you can leave to the families. Confucianism was based on the Chinese family, and in the course of 1,000 years, the Confucians became the sole source of all wisdom for state manipulation is too strong a word, but a state way of guiding the way of life of all Chinese.
Central to this wisdom was a set of social and economic values which placed farmers next to scholar bureaucrats at the top of the Confucian social hierarchy, and merchants and artisans at the bottom. To maintain social control, the Ming emperors in the 15th century stopped their merchants from going abroad and isolated China within its own fortified boundaries. All contact with foreign traders was restricted to Canton in the far south. The first European merchants to reach China by sea were the Portuguese. They were confined to the tiny island of Macau near Canton. The Jesuit missionaries who accompanied them built this church of St. Paul's in the late 16th century. But their access to the Chinese on the mainland was strictly limited.
It was impossible. They were not admitted at all. Then came Father Alexander Valignano in 1579, visitor of all Jesuits in the East. And every morning, after getting up from bed, you open the window of the College of St. Paul, looking at the China, you'll say, "When will thou be open, O rock? When will thou be open, O rock? When will thou be open, O rock?"
It was Father Macio Ricci who finally opened the rock and established their mission on the mainland. From his studies of the Chinese language and culture, he devised a plan for winning converts in China. This involved gaining the support of the powerful Confucian bureaucrats, who unfortunately were to mistake the Jesuits in their humble robes for lowly Buddhist priests. Ricci realized that something had to be done.
And then it changed, knowing that the scholars in China were very well appreciated and loved by the people. He dressed like a scholar, a very nice habit, and then a very nice hat, and then he was accepted by the Chinese community.
Ricci also realized that to have any real impact, he had to come here, to the center of imperial power. Beijing's Forbidden City. Unfortunately, it was off limits to foreigners. But an unusual gift was to open the doors to the empire's inner sanctum. Though arrested on entering Beijing, Ricci's gift, a mechanical clock, reached the emperor, who was delighted. But when it eventually stopped, it was only Ricci who had the skill to repair it. Mending the intricate mechanisms of his clocks provided the Jesuit with the perfect opportunity to demonstrate the superiority of his scientific and mathematical knowledge. It was for this that Ricci was given a job in the Department of Astronomy. Here, Chinese astronomers, using instruments like this armillary sphere, predicted and recorded auspicious events, such as eclipses and the passing of comets. What Ricci and his successor Adam Schall offered was the mathematical skills to improve their accuracy. Schall even became director of the department after predicting an eclipse more precisely than any of the Chinese astronomers. The Jesuits enabled the emperor to produce a more accurate imperial calendar. Using new astronomical instruments they set up on Beijing's city wall. The calendar was essential for the administration of the empire. But while the astute emperor happily accepted the astronomy, he politely ignored the religion. While Jesuits were applying their mathematical skill to win converts in China, Dutch merchants and shipwrights were applying theirs to more basic problems, making money and building better ships. Plan drawings using the new science of geometrical perspective revolutionized the designing of ships. They constructed enormous vessels like the Batavia, now being rebuilt in Holland from 17th century plans. These were designed to make the arduous voyages to the Far East, to win not souls, but the riches of the China trade. These mighty craft were a high point of Dutch technological achievement. At the famous naval shipyard at Zaandam, they were turning them out at the rate of one a week. But the Dutch were to achieve their great wealth and power, not just because of their superior technology, but because they also invented new and more efficient ways of doing business. In the early 17th century, enterprising Dutch merchants came up with 3 new commercial institutions, which were to play a crucial role in the expansion of European capitalism. The Amsterdam Deposit Bank, which stabilized the currency and made financial transactions more secure. The stock exchange, or bourse, which provided a new source of capital by offering shares in trading firms that could be bought and sold on an open market. But it was the joint stock company that linked both the bourse and the bank, which allowed Dutch merchants to accumulate enormous wealth and to extend their power and influence around the globe. The wealthy Protestant merchants who ran these great trading companies dominated Dutch society and its values. They embodied a mixture of Puritan self-discipline and ruthless greed. These are the directors of the Dutch East India Company, the most famous of the new joint stock companies which dominated Europe's trade with the East. Their charter gave them a monopoly on this trade, along with the right to wage war and govern foreign territories, all in the interest of their stockholders and the Dutch Republic. From its base in Java, the ships of the Dutch East India Company fleet extended their trading network throughout the East. In 1603, they captured a Portuguese ship with a cargo of silk and porcelain worth a cool 3.5 million guilders. The fight was on. The following year, the Dutch tried to take this Portuguese fort at Macau, manned in part by Jesuit priests.
They landed 1,000 soldiers and marines from 15 warships. They landed there and they came marching through Macau. So nobody opposed them, you see. But then a gun from here, the Jesuit fathers fire a gun from here, and the gun hit the powder magazine. And then the powder burnt and killed the commander. And then they, what to do now? They hesitated. At the same time, a Jesuit father called, "Come on, the Dutch are defeated, everyone comes, you know." Dutch left banners and everything behind, and they ran for life. and the Portuguese, in honor of St. John Baptist, because it was St. John Baptist Day, 24th of June, and as you know, St. John Baptist was beheaded by King Herod, so they beheaded 300 to 400 Dutch in honor of the great St. John Baptist. Only 300 to 400.
This is what the Dutch were after, Chinese porcelain, one of the most sought-after luxuries from the East. In Europe at this time, no craftsman could match the quality of these wares. In China, porcelain produced for export was controlled by the state, and its manufacture a carefully guarded secret. In ancient step kilns like these in Fujian, master potters had learned by careful observation to control temperatures at 1,000 degrees or more, creating ceramics of extraordinary strength and glazes of great refinement and beauty. This knowledge was passed down through families and locked in the highly secretive tradition of China's craft guilds. In Europe, these traditions were to be broken by the rise of science and public education. The scale of this state-run industry was enormous, and by the 17th century, the European demand for porcelain produced in these factories was growing at such a rate that even the most avaricious European merchant could not keep pace. But all this, very suddenly, came to a resounding halt. In 1644, the Manchus from the far north invaded and drove out the Ming dynasty. Over the next 30 years, China was thrown into chaos as the new Qing dynasty fought to gain control of the empire.
This meant enormous internal turmoil in China, disrupting the whole economy, all its trade lines. And of course, this meant that European consumers no longer had access to Chinese products, particularly porcelain. And this gave an opportunity for European producers to jump into the gap, to fill the market space. In Delft, a town not far from Amsterdam, is a good example. The brewers, rich in wealth, decided to transfer their monies into the new avenues. With a combination of ingenuity, hard work, and a lot of money, they created Delftware, which was an imitation porcelain, blue and white, made out of clay, definitely an inferior product, but one that could make the grade just about. Soon, a third of the town were engaged in the production of what was a substitute. This meant that they were also involved in what can only really be called false advertising, because stamped upon the pottery were Chinese characters, obviously giving the impression that they came from China. So the Europeans had discovered, at a very early date, the commercial value of imitation and copying, long before the Japanese arrived on the scene in the early 20th century.
From the great Dutch ports of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and here at Hoorn, both genuine and imitation porcelain were shipped throughout Europe to meet the growing tastes for Asian luxuries. But despite the temporary decline in trade from China, Dutch merchants exploring the Far East brought back with them not only new commodities to expand European tastes, but exotic collections that were to expand their intellectual horizons as well. For the men of learning, these collections provided evidence of worlds unaccounted for in the Bible or classical literature, and demanded new explanations and theories. These not only challenged the traditional dogmas of the Church, but helped lay the foundations of Europe's scientific revolution.
A rhinoceros fetus from the Spice Islands of Java. Tulips we think of as Dutch, came from Central Asia. Collections of shells and fish from Ambon, where the cloves came from. These collections and curiosities came to Europe along with the tea, porcelain, spices, and silks on the Dutch East India trade. And they provided concrete evidence that the growth of knowledge promoted by the men of science since the time of Galileo could be as enriching to society as the growth of trade, especially when the exotic could be turned to profit. And this was not lost on the European royal patrons either. They too were to sponsor the new scientific institutions which from the end of the 17th century were to dominate the intellectual and social life of Europe.
In 1662, Charles II was made patron of the newly established Royal Society in London. 4 years later, Louis XIV established the Academy of Sciences in Paris. These new institutions were set up to promote the experimental methods of science. These new methods had been pioneered by the astronomer Galileo, who argued that mathematics was the key to understanding the language of the universe. For Isaac Newton, an early president of the Royal Society, the universe worked like a giant clockwork mechanism, governed by precise mathematical laws. To reconcile these new ideas with religion, God was even regarded as the ultimate mathematician, who, having created a universe that operated according to these laws, simply wound it up and let it run. This mechanistic view of the world is the basis of modern science. It was founded by these 17th century mathematicians and astronomers, but its practical application was in the hands of a new and influential class of craftsmen, the clock and instrument makers.
The instrument makers, of course, had already formed an important trade in 17th century England, but the revelation of the Newtonian worldview gave them, in a sense, a new status. It gave mathematics a new status within science, and therefore it gave the mathematical instrument maker a new edge, if you like. It was particularly significant that they could become fellows of the Royal Society and achieved an unprecedented status in the scientific community of the time. And this gave these makers an identity with the scientific enterprise. They got to know the scientists within the society, they got to understand their concerns and their needs, and it helped them to develop the kind of instruments that the natural philosophers or scientists were actually in need of.
At the Royal Greenwich Observatory, this new relationship between scientists and craftsmen was to pay off in very practical terms. The observatory was set up by Charles II in 1675 to improve the navigational ability of British merchant fleets, now challenging the Dutch for the domination of international trade. 2 giant pendulum clocks were built by the instrument maker Thomas Tompion to calculate the precise time of one rotation of the Earth. With this knowledge, it was possible to divide the globe into precise time zones, so that sailors, using the time at Greenwich, could calculate their longitude, which gave them their precise position. But to do this, they needed clocks of extraordinary stability and precision to keep accurate time at sea. It was the clockmaker John Harrison who came up with a solution: sprung pendulums to stabilize the mechanism. The British government had offered a prize of £20,000, over $1 million in contemporary terms, to anyone who could build a reliable marine chronometer. With his remarkable mathematical and engineering skill, Harrison won the prize and revolutionized global navigation. merchant fleets could now find their way around the globe with increasing precision. The world had not only grown smaller, but was now bound by a new perspective in which time and space were standardized from the Thames to the South China Sea. It was this new vision of the world that the Jesuits were attempting to introduce to the Chinese scholars and bureaucrats. In their great library in Beijing, the Jesuits, with the help of their converts, translated Western books on science and engineering. But it was difficult for the Chinese to reproduce the intricate workings of these new machines without a tradition of perspective or plan drawing. In Europe, a craftsman could build a working machine from this three-dimensional drawing of a pump. But even the most ingenious Chinese craftsman would have been completely baffled by what to do with this. In China, books and drawings weren't made for illiterate craftsmen, but for scholars and officials. For them, technical details were of little real interest and were often lost in clouds of imprecision. In the early 18th century, the French Academy of Sciences provided educated craftsmen with access to the tools of science in their efforts to discover the secrets of Chinese porcelain. Porcelain is a composite material made up of a mixture of ground kaolin rock and other minerals. Unlike clay, it is extremely strong. It was invented by the Chinese and allowed them to make exquisite and durable ceramics, which the Europeans, with only clay at their disposal, could never match. More and more porcelain was being imported from China, and Western merchants were even commissioning bowls and plates designed specifically for European tastes and requirements. These Chinese exports generated an enormous demand in the West, and European producers wanted their share of the market. To protect the secret of their success, the Chinese refused to allow foreigners to visit the centers of porcelain production. The French now turned to Jesuit missionaries for help.
As Jesuits were evangelizing in China, one of them, Father d'Entrecol, received an order from one of his superior in Paris, who happened to be related to a future Minister of Finance named Horry. He received the order to go to Qingdechen and to try to spy, look how this paste was made, this porcelain was made. And he wrote two letters, one in 1712, the other one in 1724. This letter went together to France with samples and misunderstanding. The different ceramicists working in the French Academy of Science tried reading Entrecol's letter. They tried to produce porcelain that was like the Chinese porcelain. And they came eventually on something totally new, which had the same quality, but which was totally different, which we still call soft paste porcelain.
With access to this new material, the French porcelain industry was born here at Sèvres, on the outskirts of Paris. In a gesture of extraordinary cheek, the French Minister for Trade commissioned a sculpture of the Emperor Qianlong. It was taken from a Jesuit drawing and made with the new porcelain. With this, he hoped to impress the emperor with the accomplishments of French industry and the desirability of its products. Along with the best products of French industry, the statue of the emperor was brought as part of a trade mission to China to convince the imperial court to open its doors to Western goods. Yet, for the emperor, none of the achievements of European industry matched those of his own craftsmen, except one. Chinese craftsmen were unable to match the precision engineering that drove these elaborate clocks. Over 2,000 were brought by successive European trade missions, yet none could convince the emperor of the value of Western technological ingenuity. Trade with China was only possible through the port of Canton, where European merchants had been allowed to establish a tiny trading base. Here, they were only permitted to deal with merchants authorized by the Chinese government. But the problem for the European traders was that they were forced to pay in gold or silver, and the Chinese weren't buying anything in exchange. What the Europeans wanted was more equal trade.
It was very hard for the Manchu Qing government to appreciate what's it got to do with us. I mean, you want trade, fine, come along. We'll give you as much trade as we think you deserve. But what's all this about equality between states for trading purposes and so on? How can you be equal to us? We're a great empire. You are simply a bunch of merchants representing a king somewhere, far, far away, and mostly irrelevant to what we need. That's the sort of background. And in that background, for the Europeans to keep knocking again and again, demanding to be let in to trade on equal terms, seemed almost insulting and certainly irrelevant to the main needs of the empire.
Despite the conflict over trade, the image of Chinese society which reached Europe from Jesuit missionaries at the imperial capital was far from irrelevant. Their idealized vision of China appealed to the insecure monarchs of Europe who envied the empire's great stability. This they attributed to its bureaucratic government. Louis XVI of France even adopted a Chinese-style examination system to select his civil servants. He even affected the rituals of the Chinese emperor, romantically depicted here ploughing the first furrow in the agricultural year. In the great aristocratic houses of Europe, chinoiserie, the taste for Chinese art and design, was all the rage. Like this reproduction of the famous Chinese room in the Potsdam Palace in Dresden. At Woburn Abbey, rare Chinese deer still roam the grounds. Like many European aristocrats, the Duke of Bedford even had this dairy built in the fashionable Chinese style. Tea from China was about to transform the English way of life.
In theory, it was the wife of the 7th Duke, Anna Maria, who invented this very English habit of taking tea in the afternoon at 4 o'clock. I suppose you had China tea. When did you drink it? She started to drink it in the afternoon, and that's where, in theory, the habit started from.
There's a great fad for chinoiserie at the time, wasn't there? Were your family involved in popularizing this?
Well, my family, I think, looking very much to a new form of business, to be involved in the business of the day, which one of them was the East India Company, and we married the granddaughter of the president of the East India Company, and as her dowry, she bought the shares in the East India Company and the shares in Charles Bank. And I think that's what suddenly got my ancestors keen in getting a little more commercial. And so they built 2 ships, and which obviously plied that trade. And as a result, I think also got those ships to bring the decorations that you see in this room and many others, and in particular the wallpaper that was made for the room in China in 1754. I think you had the opportunity not only to originate your own scenes, but also if you didn't think there was enough decoration on them, you could order from China extra butterflies or extra birds or extra flowers. I mean, it was a very forward marketing concept.
The merchants of the China trade were not the only ones into forward marketing. Here, in the Staffordshire potteries, a new breed of craftsmen were about to capitalize on this fad for things Chinese, which had spread to all classes of society. It was led by Josiah Wedgwood, who almost single-handedly destroyed the market for Chinese porcelain in Europe. Wedgwood was a scientific enthusiast. He experimented with new materials to invent a clay which had all the properties of porcelain but was half the cost. But to do this, he needed to know the precise temperature of his kilns.
Like all potters, Wedgwood realized that clay shrinks at a fairly consistent rate when heated. So he devised this calibrated pyrometer, which links the shrinkage of a cylinder of clay to the heat of the kiln. For this invention, he was even admitted to the Royal Society in 1783. And its adoption in other Staffordshire potteries allowed for a greater increase in the standardization of production and the range and consistency of their domestic crockery.
Wedgwood's Chinaware was soon being marketed throughout the length and breadth of Europe. By the late 18th century, European craftsmen were not only catching up with the achievements of the Chinese, but clearly surpassing them. These French clockwork dolls are yet another example of the extraordinary engineering abilities of the European craftsmen. From the Palace of Versailles to the court in Peking, these automated toys were a source of endless entertainment. However, the engineering potential embodied in these seemingly frivolous machines was not lost on other craftsmen. They took this simple principle for controlling complex movement and turned it into a mechanism for profit. At Lyon, the center of the French silk industry, a group of innovative weavers applied this technology to manufacturing, to make them more competitive against the Chinese. Weaving patterns into silk fabric was both labor-intensive and slow. Jean-Marie Jacquard came up with these punch cards to automate the process. This technique for silk weaving had been invented in China over 1,000 years ago and involved 2 men working the loom. The master weaver controlled the movement of the shuttle. To control the pattern, the long warp threads were lifted by the draw boy. However, to change designs, he had to learn thousands of new moves. By the early 19th century, these cards had replaced the draw boy. When coupled with the power loom, it was even possible to eliminate the weaver himself. The key to all this was the driving power of water. The use of water power for driving looms and spinning thread became possible with the application of the precision engineering skills of the European clock and instrument makers. But more important than technology, which is so often used to explain social change, was the creation of an entirely new and quite revolutionary institution, the factory system of production. It was the traditional technology and skills of independent artisans which were taken by the entrepreneurs of the English factory system and mechanized. With access to capital and water power to drive a vast battery of machines, a new class of industrialists took over the business of spinning and weaving. But the economies of scale that made these early factories possible required ever-expanding markets and a political commitment to growth and change. What's intriguing, however, is that the Chinese had water-driven technology 400 years before the English, and yet they didn't develop a factory system. Water power was even being used to automate the spinning of cotton as early as the 14th century. So why didn't it have the same revolutionary impact it had in 18th century Europe? The fact was that China's traditional economic and cultural institutions were unable to change. They remained under the control of the conservative Confucian bureaucrats who administered the empire. Their priorities were not with the development of new technology or the expansion of international trade.
What was much more important was clever methods being applied to increase productivity in agriculture. Then the state was in favor of that. But anything beyond that, the state really looked upon as being totally irrelevant. In its place, this emphasis upon harmony and on moral order and so on engaged all the best brains in the country. And some of these best brains in their spare time did a bit of science and technology, but it was also regarded as a hobby and something you can enjoy, but nothing to do with the needs of the state. So again, it comes back to the nature of a strong bureaucratic state, philosophically strengthened by Confucianism, and feeling that they don't need science and technology for what they want to do. They've got the answers already. And why would you want to increase productivity that much when we already have enough?
In the highly competitive environment of Europe, there was never enough. In Britain, individual entrepreneurs with access to capital and new labor-saving technology were mass-producing cheaper and better goods for an ever-expanding market. The operation of this market was even regarded as a moral mechanism. The more productive and efficient the factory, the greater the returns to the individual owner or shareholders. In the process, the nation got richer and the consumers more choice. And what's more, it was even sanctified by religion. The Protestant work ethic was to play as important a role in legitimizing the values of the Industrial Revolution as Confucian concerns with harmony were to reinforce the agrarian values in China. Artisans in the traditional cottage industries were put out of business by the factory system. They could find jobs and a regular salary in the new cotton mills, but this meant taking on the work discipline of the factory clock. Here, time was money, and waste of either would incur God's wrath. As a consequence, these cotton mills were run with a ruthless concern for efficiency and profit.
And you began to get mill owner philosophers whose most advanced exponent was a man called Dr. Andrew Ure, who published a book called The Philosophy of Manufactures in 1835, who had this picture of a mill being a working automata in which the people were only sort of little bits and cogs of the whole great machine, and the object of the whole process was to make the humans as like pieces of machinery as possible. That also meant they had to be internally habituated to the measurement of work out in this way. And in this sense, you can see some of the features which some of the religious beliefs, particularly Methodism, took in this period as being part of the internalization of the new work discipline of the factory and the mill system.
Here, young women and children were shackled to machines for up to 14 hours a day for the good of their souls and the greater glory of capitalism. The result of all this was cheaper textiles and Manchester becoming synonymous with cotton cloth. This was traded around the world in exchange for the raw materials to keep the factories running. This commerce supplied the lifeblood of Britain's growing wealth and power. It also justified the building of its colonial empire. Its mission was to bring the morality of the marketplace to the less enlightened corners of the globe. China was one corner which steadfastly refused to be converted to the European gospel of free trade. In 1794, George III of England sent Lord Macartney on a mission to try and convince the Emperor Qianlong to relax the trading restrictions in Canton and to allow British industrial goods to be sold in China. Macartney brought with him the usual lavish gifts: astronomical instruments, clocks, and examples of British manufactured goods. He even brought some examples of Josiah Wedgwood's latest jasperware, which was a source of enormous interest. But despite this, the emperor politely but firmly restated traditional policy.
Our celestial empire possesses all things in abundance and lack no product within our borders. There is therefore no need to import the manufactured goods of outside barbarians in exchange for our products.
Britain and China were set on a course of almost inevitable confrontation. This was the catalyst. Opium, produced in enormous quantities by the British East India Company factories in Bengal. In the early 19th century, British and American fleets began to smuggle opium into Canton. This was exchanged for hard currency to pay for Chinese goods. The social impact was appalling, and corrupt officials turned a blind eye as the economy was drained. In 1839, the emperor sent an incorruptible official, Commissioner Lin, to stop the trade. Like the head of a modern-day drug enforcement agency, Lin raided the European factories and arrested the merchants. 21,000 chests of opium were destroyed. As a reprisal, the British government sent gunboats, and the first opium war with China had begun. British gunboats, equipped with new technology born of the Industrial Revolution, moved inexorably up the Yangtze, smashing forever the illusion of the Empire's power and invulnerability. In the calculations of the British government, the moral issue of the opium trade was clearly to take second place to the much higher principle of the market and international commerce. Like the steam engine, which now drove the cotton mills of Lancashire and the boats which served the gunboats on the Yangtze, the market was regarded as a self-regulating mechanism. Driven by the force of supply and demand, the market would serve the interest of everybody as long as government provided the individual consumer and producer with maximum freedom to do what he liked, even to consume opium. This was called enlightened self-interest. In this idea of the market as a mechanism running according to laws like Newton's clockwork universe, the political economists of the day believed that they had discovered the hidden hand of progress, the secret to unlimited wealth and power. For the Chinese emperor, ironically depicted in this feature film, playing with his collection of European clocks, these values were as remote as the possibility of his empire's defeat. At Nanjing in August 1842, the Chinese surrendered. They were forced to pay the British $21 million for the war and lost opium, and to open up 5 treaty ports for trade on European terms. An action which only further convinced the Chinese of the moral bankruptcy of the West.
However reassuring their sense of moral superiority might have been, it provided the Chinese with little consolation as they reviewed their battered forts, like this one here on the Pearl River, which was taken in 1841. The Chinese defenses were hopelessly inadequate against the obviously superior firepower of the British gunboats. It was now obvious to even the most conservative of officials that they had no alternative but to come to terms with the alien values and technologies which had provided the British with their extraordinary industrial wealth and overwhelming military power.